Welcome to panel 5, where we're going to discuss about indirect costs, and particularly the implementation of a 10% de minimis rate requirement. Joining me on the panel is Beth Bowsky. She is the policy specialist for government nonprofit contracting at the National Council of Nonprofits, and Carol Kraus, which was on a couple other panels. She is the director of Grant Accountability and Transparency Unit for the state of Illinois. Welcome. So let me talk a little bit about indirect costs. The total allowable costs for grant projects include both the direct and indirect costs minus any applicable credit. The direct costs are pretty straightforward and relate to costs that are such as salaries and wages, supply, equipment, some travels in there that can be easily identified to one project. Indirect costs, on the other hand, are more complicated. They are essential costs to organization, but the uniform guidance have special rules to identify them, allocate them, and claim them on federal projects. Indirect costs has been negotiated in the past, under different OMB circulars, but the new uniform guidance introduced a new concept, the 10% de minimis rate. It's a new feature in section 200-414. It was intended to reduce burden, particularly for smaller grantees, and allow grantees to recover indirect costs for running federal programs. Since it is the new features, we have heard from many stakeholders on the proper implementation of it. We will discuss some of the implementation issues and best practice with our panelists from the nonprofit community and state representative.
Thanks. Gil, I think to get started, why don't we talk about, is that 10% de minimis rate applicable to all subrecipients?
It's not applicable to all recipients. What it is available, to some recipient, and the 10 de minimis rate is available for new grantees and grantees that have not previously negotiated a rate with the federal, with the federal government. It's not a de facto rate when the pass-through entity is taking that rate when dealing with the subrecipient. So let me start out with a general question about indirect costs. Why is indirect costs important for nonprofit? Why receiving payment of that are essential?
It is the most essential thing in the uniform guidance to the nonprofit community because they are really, for the most part, struggling quite a bit financially. Mm-hmm. There are subawards, they're estimating from anecdotal and non-scientific surveys, it appears that nonprofits are typically paid 20 to 25% below what it actually costs them to provide the services. There are a couple of new studies out that show that a nonprofit, the higher their percentage of their budget is, or the revenues in their budget are from government grants and contracts, the more likely they are to be in financial trouble. And it's because for many, many years, particularly at the subrecipient level, there's been little, if any, reimbursement of indirect costs. So the implementation of the uniform guidance and the 10% or the negotiated rate based on the federal cost principles from requirement for pass-throughs to pay subrecipients is absolutely critical for nonprofit survival, really, because even in 2010, I believe, GAO did a study of how indirect costs are being paid by different states and pass-through entities, and they really couldn't find any rhyme or reason. Some paid zero, some paid, I think one paid 14%, which is almost unheard of. And they concluded the report by saying, if this doesn't change, nonprofits aren't going to be around, and they're partners of government that we really depend on.
Right. Carol, from your state perspective?
Well, I agree with Beth on a lot of it. I mean, since we pass through such a lot of the funds through to our subrecipients, we need to pay our fair share of the cost of carrying out the programs and the objectives of that program. If we can continue to do that, not pay indirect costs, we will have nobody to pass it through to, number one.
Right.
Number two, I mean, there are partners. We need to treat them as partners. And if they're not successful, neither are we. And the fact that you don't pay indirect costs really will result in more fraud, waste, and abuse because they got to use money that from one grant to cover another grant that doesn't pay it. I mean, it really doesn't give them a lot of incentive. They have to pay their bills. We need to pay it for all grants, not just some.
So, Carol, from your other panel, you mentioned that the state of Illinois have thousands of subrecipients,
Right.
and every one of them now under Section 203.31, the state, as a pass-through entity, have to do something about, give them an indirect cost rate. What are some of the way that you implement without overly burdening your whole state process?
Well, what we chose to do is to centralize it. We're really modeling after the federal requirements. How the feds come in and you negotiate one rate, and all the federal awarding agencies have to accept that rate. We're modeling that in Illinois. We're centralizing it. We have one rate negotiated, and all the agencies are required to accept that rate. Again, as you mentioned, when we have 28,000 awards going out the door and approximately 5,000 unduplicated subrecipients, it is going to save a lot of time and effort on both sides of that fence. So it's a really cost-effective way of carrying out having to negotiate rates.
Beth, in terms of when a nonprofit is facing with having to have a project through a pass-through entity, what is your advice for that nonprofit to get an indirect cost rate?
Well, number one, nonprofits really need to understand what their indirect costs are, and frankly, because this is a new piece, those that have not had federally approved rates, this is new for them. So they need to learn how to figure out what their indirect costs are to begin with, and then to approach the pass-through entity, if they decide to about negotiating a rate based on the federal cost principles, so that they can get as close to their actual costs as possible. There may be times, and obviously the 10% provides an option to not have to go through all the documentation of proving that your rate is a certain amount, but that you still internally have to figure out what your rate is, whether you're using the 10% or not. So that work doesn't change any.
So basically what you're saying is, regardless whether you as a nonprofit elect to go for the 10% de minimis rate, you should document how much it really costs you to do the business.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. You need to know how much it costs to provide a service or to do business, regardless.
Okay, so starting next year, actually this year, on the single audit preparation, we're going to collect whether an entity is electing to use the 10% de minimis rate or not, starting this with this fiscal year audit. From your perspective, have a lot of entities taking this 10% de minimis rate, or they still debating what needs to be done? Carol?
I think what you're going to find with a lot of our grantees, some of them because they're scared of the whole process of negotiating a rate. A lot of them are talking about doing a de minimis rate in the beginning and then probably negotiating a rate later. I know Beth and her group has been working on a tool for them to try to figure out what's the best way to go, because a lot of the work comes in separating out the direct from the indirect. And so, also part of what we're doing is we're getting ready to launch we're testing it right now, where we're going to launch a system where they can come on and negotiate it through a website and provide training and more training to teach them exactly what are the steps to do it. We also want to work with the National Council of Nonprofit, and Beth, you can talk to this better than I, and trying to show them what is the difference between the two, because really, quite frankly, a lot of the work comes in separating out direct from indirect, which would be required in the 10%.
So it's
in order to allocate them.
So
Yes.
it sounds to me, Carol, that at state of Illinois, you don't treat the 10% de minimis rate as the de facto rate.
No, we do
Or
not.
you don't treat that as the cap rate. If
No.
an organization have done their homework, come in and negotiate, you would take a look at it and negotiate.
Yes, we would. We
Yeah.
would, and that's a big important thing that the subrecipients need to understand is it is their choice of what they want to do. We're required to accept the federal rate. You can elect if if it's applicable to you, the de minimis rate, or you can negotiate a rate based on separating out those costs. And we're really trying to work with everybody to take the simplified method, the direct method, so that they can see that it isn't as cumbersome as they think.
Beth, on the other panel, what Carol was on, we're discussing subrecipient and contractors. And it does have an impact on indirect cost rate.
Well, I mean, I think obviously it's important for the reasons that the other panel discussed to determine whether a nonprofit is a subrecipient or a contractor.
That's correct.
Because it depends on what they're auditing and the reporting requirements and whatnot. What we're finding, one of the reasons that this 10% is turning into a de facto rate is that there's a belief that whether you're a contractor or a subrecipient determines whether you're eligible for the 10%, which
That's right.
should not have. I mean, you need to know whether you're a contractor, a subcontractor, or a subrecipient. I'm sorry, and a contractor, but that should not affect whether or not you're being reimbursed for indirect costs.
Right. So for one of the things that we heard is a lot of states have program work that's done at the subrecipient level, but they call it as contracts in order to
Absolutely.
get out of paying indirect costs, and
Right.
that's definitely a wrong approach.
Absolutely. I mean, and pastors have typically used contracts anyway,
Sure.
at least what they call contracts. It's not what the federal government considers a contract. But there are multiple ways. Unfortunately, this 10% is turning into a de facto rate, and so I think one of them is the concern about the amount of work. As Carol said, you've got 5,000 awards that need to be negotiated.
Right.
That's a lot of work, understandably so.
Right.
But Illinois has also figured out, well, let's centralize this and do this all, one time, and it's not as big a deal anymore. So that nonprofits have the opportunity to negotiate a rate and not just have to accept the 10%, which is what's happening in most places. They're just being told it's 10%.
Carol?
The other issue that we found as we were implementing that, as Beth alluded to a little bit, is people just picking numbers out of the air.
Right.
And putting arbitrary caps when it isn't really from a federal statute that allows them to have a cap on the indirect cost rates. So that's another issue we were battling, and as I said in an earlier session, we are requiring you to show us where the rules are that say there is a limitation and not just to arbitrarily put those limitations on the grantees because of funding issues or other concerns.
Okay, so
It's definitional.
so we have 1 minute. Right on top of your mind, you're a subrecipient. What are the 3 things that you need to remember?
That administrative costs and indirect costs are not the same thing.
Okay. 2.
Because that's being done. I need to really understand what costs are, this is about being fair. This isn't about trying to keep costs down for government. I fully understand that's everybody's been in financial crunches, and the push is always keep the cost down, keep the cost down. But this is about paying what's fair, not about keeping the cost down. And so you need to start looking at things a little bit differently.
Carol, 3 things.
3 things I would say. Understand that it is up to you and you have options to implement your indirect cost. Also to be aware of all the rules, be aware there are federal limitations out there, be aware before you apply for a grant that those are out there. And don't be scared of negotiating a rate, Really do some homework, get some training, and figure out how to do this. And you're not really necessarily going to hire a company to do it for you.
Okay. So I note down 3 things myself, and we're going to close with that. Sound like I gather from our discussion indirect costs as essential costs. The 10% de minimis rate is not a de facto rate. And most importantly, Beth, you reiterate that, do your homework, know your option, and know your costs. And with that, I would like to thank both of you for this very enlightening discussion.
Thank you.